Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I love every opportunity to talk about night skies, but with a background in ecology and permaculture, this is a particular treat. I don't get many folks asking about night skies and how it relates to plants and how plants interact with the eclipse. So we're going to have a lot of fun dialogue. And that's one of the things I want this to be, as I was mentioning earlier to Deborah and Paula, this is only maybe the 4th or 5th time I've given this presentation as a PowerPoint because I like this to be more of a conversation. So if you have a question while I'm talking, if you have a comment, if you want to correct me, please raise your hand, speak up, shout in the back. You know, I want you to feel like you're part of this as well. That way I'm not just talking at you. Okay. But yes, so I am with Hill Country Alliance. I've been with HCA for a little over 2 years now as the Night Sky Program Manager. And at the same time I came on board, I took over the wonderfully delightful and a little bit stressful responsibility of managing the Hill Country Eclipse team. So within the Night Sky program, I work in various areas, but Hill Country Alliance in general, we are, for those of you that aren't familiar, we're a nonprofit conservation organization located across 17 counties in the Hill Country. So we work in 5 different areas. So we have land, water, night sky, community, and we have a network program. So I get the benefit of working in night sky. So for me, that involves a lot of working in the community. Who in here does not know what light pollution is? Awesome. I was just having a conversation with my coworkers this last week, and they asked me, you know, what would be a great indicator that your work is getting proliferated out into the community across the Hill Country? And I said, it's the day I don't walk into a room and have to explain what light pollution is. So this is awesome. So you guys are well ahead of the curve. But for how that happens here, you know, light pollution is a fairly new construct. It's a new challenge compared to water pollution and land and air. So most people outside of this room don't really know what it is. So we do a lot of our work, boots on the ground, grassroots kind of movement, talking face to face with folks, educating folks on what light pollution is, why it's so detrimental, and working within the community to build what we call Friends of the Night Sky groups, which I'm curious, does anyone in this room, are you aware that you actually have a Friends of the Night Sky group in Gillespie County? All right, one of you does. You can speak with her afterwards about information. But last year, a group did form here in Gillespie County. We meet monthly in Fredericksburg to combat this issue of light pollution. As these GMIs were just mentioning, being an increasingly problematic issue, despite there being an ordinance in the community, despite there being efforts to move forward. We also do this through education at the city government level. So we work with a lot of municipalities to do things like revise or pass outdoor lighting ordinances to improve the lighting and to hopefully tamp down and possibly abate that light pollution issue. And then things like Hill Country Night Sky Month. Are any of you familiar with that? Does it ring a bell? Oh, awesome. Well, I will make sure that the Gillespie County group gets in touch with you guys. So, yes, sir.
You work with Austin, San Antonio also?
Yes, I do. Actually, I work outside of our 17 counties. I work around about 19 to 20 counties because I like to say my night sky has no borders. So even though we don't necessarily operate on a regular basis with counties outside of the 17, because light pollution and light dome trespass can be seen upwards of 30, 40, and 50 miles from a city center, it's important to make sure that communities and counties that surround what we designate the Hill Country are doing their best efforts. So yes. Yes, actually we are. Just last year, we went through a whole process in the city of San Antonio in updating their military lighting overlay district ordinance, which in a nutshell takes a 5-mile buffer zone around all 5 of their military installations and regulates the lighting there. So they actually meet international dark sky compliance and also that of the Illuminating Engineering Society. So we're making headway in San Antonio. As a resident of Travis County, Austin's got a big target on their back. And so my my philosophy is sort of gentle night sky peer pressure. So I could go to Austin and go like, hey, see what San Antonio just did? Yeah, you want to do better than them, right? Hey, San Antonio, Austin's catching up on you. You know, kind of play them off one another. But especially in the larger metropolitan areas, this kind of movement, you don't look for immediate, gratification. This is not a instantaneous response. Night sky preservation, you're in it for the long game. So out of the sort of multitude of areas that we could talk about, these are sort of the avenues that I want to kind of go over with you guys tonight. So unfortunately, we do live in a society, specifically here in North America and the United States, and also in Europe, where over 80% of our population lives in light polluted skies. And we estimate that between 30 and 40% of all humans on this planet live where they cannot see the Milky Way. How many of you guys can walk off your, let's say, front porch or back porch at night and look up and see a multitude of stars? Okay. How many of you used to be able to, but can't anymore? Okay, not as many. It's one of the reasons why we call the hill country the edge of night. So as you'll see in a couple of different slides, and you can even see it here now, we've got this lovely corridor. There's my little laser pointer, and it's very easy to point out, what some of these big cities are here. Do we all know what this one is? Dallas Fort Worth. There's no hiding from satellite imagery like this. And whereas, you've got this very clear defining line between sort of the eastern part of the states and the western part of the states, we have that here in central Texas. So we have what's called the edge of night. And it's where outside of San Antonio and Austin and that sort of I-35 corridor, it proceeds to get increasingly more dark. And that's a heritage that we are losing very quickly. It's one that we want to preserve. And it's one that we don't really have any choice to ignore anymore, because it seems like no matter where you go, wherever you travel, even if you live somewhere where you can see the Milky Way, where you can see stars at night, odds are at some point over the course of a year or so, you're going to travel to somewhere where you can't. And that's where the vast majority of folks like me live. I live in a very urban area in North Austin. And even 17 years ago when I moved here, I could see more stars than I can see now. And it's only getting worse. But this is what we're trying to save. This is what we're trying to preserve. One of the great things about doing the work that I get to do in the hill country is there is so much beauty. There is so much history. There is so much heritage. There are so many people that are clamoring to hold on to that bit that is 100 years old or even 200 years old, or that place that we know where indigenous people lived, and maintaining that so we can pass that on to future generations. And unfortunately, that is very much in our hands. We have that level of control. So whether it's halting things like development or encouraging developers to take better practices with regards to night skies or water usage or land usage, this is our responsibility in this small little corner of the world. Unfortunately, it's being recognized. And in many cases, many organizations, especially, I'll say International Dark Sky Association, even though they recently changed names to Dark Sky International, but the International Dark Sky Association has even recognized in the past that the Texas Hill Country is one of the most active regions in the world with regards to night sky preservation. So we're doing something right. We just need to keep it going. We need to keep that momentum. We need to keep talking with people about it. Because until I can walk into every room like this and not have to educate folks on what light pollution is, there's still work to be done. So one of the areas that I have found particularly interesting with regards to light pollution, as you may be aware, everything, every living creature on this planet, every human, every mammal, every insect, every fish, every reptile, everything, every plant, every tree is affected in one way or another by light pollution. And in Central Texas, we actually have 9 endemic species So they're not found anywhere else but in Central Texas, that are on the endangered species list, that are impacted by light pollution. Now, as a native plant society, I know you're not particularly interested in things like the salamanders or the fish, but Texas snowbell, Texas wild rice, those are two endangered endemic species that are affected. And by such, they're affected because light pollution interferes with the species that feed on them. The light pollution affects their native circadian rhythm. So just like we humans have circadian rhythms, plants have that as well. So by the artificial light infiltrating these areas, these plants, as you'll see through a lot of slides, they don't have the ability to distinguish that light, dark, night, day delineation. And their cycles can get thrown off, which impacts every part that's attached to them. So whether it's the animals that feed on the Texas wild rice, and then the animals that feed on those animals, it's a huge web. It's all tremendously interconnected. There we go. So these are probably some of the most shocking photos that I have found when it comes to how plants are adversely affected. So the top graphic there, you've got two different onsets of leaf coloring stages in what's a staghorn sumac. So you can see right there a very tall, not very night sky friendly light fixture that has completely, in this case, thrown off the color changing cycle of the leaves. And in the case of this plant, you can see the light affecting this portion of the tree, the other portion of the tree. It still has its thoughts as far as, okay, I'm going through my cycles, it's time to get rid of these leaves, except for this portion here, which is a little bit delayed because it doesn't know how to differentiate between that constant light being on all the time. These are two different circumstances where these are soybean fields. And especially from this one, you can very clearly get a sense, even though you can't see them necessarily, you can get a very clear sense of where along this strip of highway those street lights are positioned. And this is such that a lot of growers are starting to put into regulations of not allowing growth or not purchasing property for growth within certain large scale lighting fixtures, within things like large scale highway installations, because this level of impact, you're looking at anywhere from 20 to 40% decrease in yield just based on the light pollution alone. And this is just two examples of scenarios that are occurring all over the country and then all over the world, especially in very high growth population areas where they have a lot of farming and a lot of industry. We're seeing a lot of this degradation in crop production. So here's sort of, I'm sure you're all familiar with the sort of life cycle of plants, but just the issues that are hindered by light pollution. So you've got photoperiodism interference. So that's not being able to delineate light and day and those cycles. And even just excessive lighting for a few hours is enough to throw off the cycle of these plants, and it just snowballs into an effect where, if it's not blooming at the right time, the pollinators are going to be thrown off. So it's not just the plant that's being affected, but of course, everything that is feeding off the plant or pollinating the plant. You're going to have actually increased photosynthesis, which, in general, from a layman's outside perspective, that's good, right? But not if it's at the expenditure of excess energy that plant may now no longer have to continue with the rest of its life cycle, because it's been photosynthesizing nonstop and it doesn't know when to cut off and move on to the next part of the cycle. You've got dormancy hindrance. So you've got trees that are, again, because of their light and dark cycle being thrown off, their dormancy periods are starting much later. They're not starting on time. Even with the changes in climate change with regards to increased temperature, all of this contributes to the fact that, we now see, for instance, bluebonnets blooming earlier. We see, cherry blossoms blooming earlier. I mean, I always feel bad every year for the folks that specifically time their travel to go to DC to see the cherry blossoms bloom, and it's completely thrown off because of excessive light pollution, because of climate change. And here's an interesting fact. So you've got elongation of photosynthesis, you've got this pollinator life cycle disrupted. They surmise that our actual pollen season is elongated. So if you're used to just having allergies in like the beginning of January and you notice them going more into February and sometimes March, or just popping up at very unusual times, odds are light pollution is in some way impacting that. Which, if that is an incentive to try to temper light pollution, I don't know what is. It's right up there with, you know, why would you want to have bright white lights on the outside of your home if that just encourages more bugs? The good news is we have a tremendous amount. Oh, yes, sir.
Does it matter what kind of light, incandescent or LED or?
So yes, does it matter what kind of light? Yes. Now it matters in the sense of, I think, more energy savings. So I'll talk a little bit about light fixtures, but the focus for all night sky preservation work is actually very determined based on color temperature. So it's a little challenging because that necessarily isn't tied into brightness. So you can have a light that is so many lumens or brighter, and those brighter or less bright light bulbs can be the same light temperature. So light temperature is the color. So that is very specific, and that does play a role in how nighttime pollinators react, how plants react. But we'll get into that a little bit later, but if I don't answer your question, ask me again. So these are all nocturnal pollinators. They are all found in Texas, Central Texas area. And I know when I first started doing a lot of this work, I thought, okay, well, bees are pollinators, moths are pollinators, dragonflies, but I was not familiar with the wide extensiveness that is the various, especially beetles. Beetles are the largest group of pollinators in the entire world. They account for 80% of pollination of the over 240,000 flowering plants globally. So they're actually really important when it comes to protecting their invested interest with regards to light pollution. We all know that fireflies are dwindling. When I first moved here to Texas, they were all over the place. They ran rampant in my neighborhood, and I have seen that decline over the years. And that's all linked. These are all interlinked together. So what happens to the fireflies happens to the moths. What happens to the bats affects the moths, it affects the beetles. You know, it's very much an all or nothing sort of scenario, unfortunately. So in this case, all of these nocturnal pollinators, you know, it's not just the pretty datura moonflowers or, you know, the prickly poppies, but, you know, we've got a lot of these, for instance, the rough-tailed gecko is very important with regards to pollination, and they like to pollinate, you know, succulents. We have a lot of cactus that lives out here, so that's really important. Your longhorn beetles, they're actually very crop specific, so they're actually nocturnal pollinators for crops. One on here that I found, let's see, mayflies. Does anyone know what mayflies pollinate? Plants along aquatic areas and riparian corridors. They're one of the few that actually is responsible for that. So if we lose the mayflies, that severely affects our riparian areas, our creeks, our streams, our pristine waters. A lot of these are also just generally, like for instance, the moth butterfly, you know, it does like the sweet flowers, it does like the pretty white flowers that it's drawn to. But all of these nocturnal pollinators have a hand in nighttime pollination, and subsequently, you know, it affects the daytime, the diurnal pollinators as well. So they're very much dependent on each other. So if you have one that's dying off, so for instance, the mayflies die off, that means that the diurnal pollinators for plants in aquatic and riparian areas, it's all on them. So then that completely skews off our entire annual cycle. So you're asking about light. And I actually have a copy of this brochure, and we've got brochures and handouts, all kinds of fun things to look at, some things if you want to take home with you. But this is a very good diagram as far as sort of, they call it very bad, bad, better, best. I think honestly, best should kind of be no light at all or only when needed. But it gives you an idea of, you know, what we're looking at when it comes to especially antique historic lighting. That is a very present and pressing challenge with regards to night sky friendly lighting. We all can go into a Home Depot or a Lowe's or an Ace and find something that works well on the exterior of our home. But to kind of harken back to the preservation of that heritage, we want to find the balance. How do we preserve the history of an area, but still take into consideration environmentally safe practices, especially with regards to historic lights and light sky pollution? This speaks a little bit better to that temperature question you were asking. So daylight is around 6,500 Kelvin. So that's that bright daytime white light. I'm sure there's not a single one of you in here that hasn't come head to head on the road with those new headlights that are white blue. That's what we want to avoid. Unfortunately, the higher you get towards this white cool cold spectrum, the more common that blue portion of the spectrum, those blue emissions come into play. So it's not so much that we don't have those blue spectrums down in this area, they're just far few in between. So we want this 3,000 Kelvin, sort of the current target. I can see in the next few years, probably some information going out that says we want to go down to 2,700 or 2,400. The big issue just mainly being use the light that's best for the environment you're using it in. So in our homes, we might pick something in a reading den that's closer to 24 or 2,700. In our kitchen, where we're doing some, you know, extensive cutting, you may not want dim lights so you don't hurt yourself. Or if you need to see the color in a dish, you're probably going to want something more that's 3,000 Kelvin. But anything in excess of that, I mean, not only is it unnecessary, it is detrimental, both for our physical state, but it's just, for the most part, it's unpleasant. Like I said, outside, on your front porch, or in your backyard, this loves to attract bugs. Don't do it. There's no reason. But it's also a game of, you know, when do you turn off your lights? Or when do you turn on your lights? So for instance, my husband, you know, often when he steps out for the evening, he'll turn on the porch light. That makes sense. He wants light, but when he comes home, he can walk up to our front porch. A lot of folks will turn it off when they go to bed. What are you doing? What are you out there trying to eliminate? You know, a lot of folks will turn it off when they leave their house, even though it never gets truly dark. Most of us can usually see to our front step or to our front porch, but there's no need for having it on constantly. So I'll kind of go into what ways that we can kind of work with that. And these are the most common types of the way light is distributed. So especially over the last few weeks, in fact, it's only just recently opened up, but we've all, I don't know how it's been here, but through most of my travels across the hill country in the past few weeks, it's been very hazy. It's been very mucky. There's been very little blue sky, which means at night we get this sky glow. So this is reflecting every single outdoor exterior light back up into the night sky. When I was a kid, I went to camp in Alabama in the summer. I do not suggest that. 100-degree temperature, 100% humidity. But the sky every night was bright orange from mercury vapor lamps and from these, you know, terribly obtrusive lamps that are just shining up into the night sky, producing this lovely orange glow. I don't think I saw a single star the entire time I was there. And most of the time during that period, I'm sure nobody saw stars, because any sort of heavy cloud cover is going to reflect any light birds upwards. Light trespass. Who here has had one of those neighbors that just won't turn off that light that happens to be shining into your bedroom or your living room? If you still have that issue, let's talk. I have some ways around that, or at least how to approach that gently, I should say. This is a big one, especially in metropolitan areas. Here you've got street lights, you've got lights on side the building, you've got decorative lights. It's excessive, it's unnecessary, but we've created this construct in our society that more light is better. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. But before we get too deep into this, I want to talk about another kind of light that some of you might be familiar with. Sunlight. I'm hoping there's no one in this room that is not aware that we have eclipses coming up. Does everyone know we've got 2 eclipses coming up? Awesome. Okay. Does everyone know the types of eclipses we have coming up? Is there anyone that's maybe not familiar? Okay. Not seeing any head nods, so we'll go through this really briefly. So there are a multitude of different types of eclipses. There's total eclipses, there's partial eclipses, there's annular, there's hybrids, which is actually where you can have a partial that morphs into a total. Fortunately, we just have these 2 very clear, straightforward eclipses coming up. So first we'll have an annular eclipse and a total solar eclipse. The annular eclipse occurs because our moon is periodically moving away from us and getting closer and moving away from us and getting closer, and it's not always on the right trajectory, so we can have a total. So in the case of October, the moon is going to be just far away from us that it won't fully cover the sun. We have about between 90 and 94% sun coverage. And I shouldn't have to tell anybody in this room, but I say it just sort of as a general safety disclaimer. No amount of sunlight showing through is safe to look at with your naked eye. Yes? See good head nods. You must wear your safe solar glasses at all times. Not even for just a little quick peek. No, any amount. Even if it were to be covered 99.9%, that 0.1% is still exceptionally detrimental. So this is one of the things that, especially you folks that live in Gillespie County, that live in Fredericksburg and southwest of Fredericksburg, you are on the path of annularity, as you'll see in a moment. So that means safe solar glasses at all times. For those of us that live outside of that path, it still means safe solar glasses at all times, because anyone who's not on the path of annularity is still going to experience a partial. And that's the same with the total eclipse 6 months later. We know it's crossing through here, but the whole rest of the continental United States, if they're not on the path, they're getting a partial eclipse. And only during totality is it when it's safe. In fact, if you don't take off your glasses during totality, you're missing the whole thing. The whole thing. Also, total solar eclipses. Once in a lifetime event. No, it's not. They occur every 18 months, somewhere on the planet. Every 18 months. But it is a unique opportunity for you to live where one is occurring that you don't have to travel to. So for instance, next month or next year, it'll be just a few days after my son's 13th birthday. And my father's going to be traveling here to Texas for that. I said, hey, stay a few days afterwards and stay for the eclipse. He'll be 78 years old, almost 79, and it'll be his first total solar eclipse ever. That's because for us, we can generally expect a total solar eclipse to occur in the generally same area on average every 375 years. Now, the last time we had an annular eclipse cut across the US was 2012. Those occur fairly more frequent. The last time we had, for instance, a total solar eclipse through the city of San Antonio, late 1800s. Last time through Austin, late 1300s. So on average, every 375 years. Now I will tell you what is rare is for these 2 eclipses to occur within 6 months of one another, crossing one another over land. In a given century, that only happens about 6% of the time. So this circumstance that we get to experience, especially that you guys get to experience because you're on both paths, that is rare. Total solar eclipses, like I said, happens every 18 months. Whether or not you have the money, the time, and the wherewithal to go travel for one, that's an entirely different story. So as I mentioned, you've got this path of annularity, path of totality. Same sort of situation in either cases. The center line here, that is going to be your maximum amount of totality or your maximum period of annularity. Everything from the center line outwards to these partiality lines, it gets increasingly, or I should say decreasingly less. So for instance, the outer edge of Austin where the eclipse is going to occur might get about 25 to 30 seconds. Center line, maximum for this eclipse is 4 minutes and 28 seconds. Maximum in Texas, 4 minutes and 26. You want 2 extra seconds? Get a ticket to Mexico. Y'all get a considerable amount of that time. So I would not consider traveling if you don't have to, which in the case of Fredericksburg, Eclipse County, you don't need to travel anywhere. Don't do it. Stay where you are. How many of you have experienced a total solar eclipse? How many of you, your first one was in 2017? Okay. So 2017 was our last total solar eclipse to cut across the United States. Before that, it was 1979. So 2017 was a huge wake-up call for folks. It was the first time we could talk about this in this country on the internet and show pictures and have social media. And that was a big deal. And so since then, people have been extensively planning for this. And if you have not had a chance to listen to a more extensive presentation on eclipses, we can definitely connect you with folks, make that happen, because there's a lot to be prepared for. Mainly just the number of folks that are going to be coming into the area. Yes.
How close is Fredericksburg to the center line? Is that line like
What you're saying is move the slide along. Well, first let's look at the annular eclipse. So as you can see from this diagram up here, Fredericksburg is just on the right side, the correct side of the path of annularity. So it's going to have, and actually I have totality here, I should say annularity, 2 minutes and 14 seconds of annularity. The most that can occur for this annular eclipse is 4 minutes and 20 seconds. So a little more than half the period of annularity you're going to experience here. If you want to experience that, make sure you are on this side of the line.
What city would be very near?
This is Fredericksburg.
Right. What city would be
So I can tell you, for instance, Vanderpool, just outside of Lost Maples State Park, is the actual crosshairs of both of these eclipses. The center line, yes. So one thing to note, and I'll show it to you specifically with this total eclipse. Partiality is squat when it comes to a total solar eclipse. Much like the safety aspect, 99.9% is still never safe. 99.9% of a total solar eclipse is diddly. My favorite analogy, it's the difference between partial eclipse is sort of like you're walking down the street of your hometown and you smell that really great Italian restaurant. And that's all you get to smell it from a few blocks away. Totality, you get to sit down, you have the nice table, you have the salad, you have the entree, you have the cannoli, the whole shebang. It is literally night and day. So you want to make sure you're on the correct part of the path. And in this case, this blue line is our center line, and here's where you are. You know how I said you get a maximum of 4 minutes and 26 seconds in this state? You get 4 minutes and 25 here. Don't go anywhere. You guys are set. You don't need to leave your home. I mean, if you want to go be with friends, it's a great opportunity. I've only experienced one in my life so far, and it's so much better with friends because you get the energy build up, you get to share it. But in the case of you folks here, you don't have the drive to go home afterwards. In 2017, I went to Casper, Wyoming to experience the eclipse. And unfortunately, due to schedules, had to leave very shortly after to get home to pick up my kids from school the next day. And from Casper, Wyoming to Cheyenne, Wyoming, it's 200 miles. And that took almost 10 hours. Yes.
Thank you so much for your picture. Here we'll see exactly what it is.
Mhm.
Total line, round line.
Yes, thank you for asking that. So she was asking, how wide is that path? So in the case of this eclipse, I believe, now it's going to taper a little the further it gets up the path. So as we get closer to sort of where it's going to exit out of Maine, the path is going to narrow. they're not going to have nearly as much totality. So you're going to be seeing closer to like 2 minutes once you get further northeast of here. On average, that path is about 150 to 170 miles. I think this here, we're looking at about 140 miles wide, which in most states is significant. In Texas, it's a drop in the bucket. And we don't, I mean, if you're familiar with that path, it starts in Mexico, it enters Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah. None of the states west of us, northwest of us, north of us are on the path. So you're going to see a lot of folks clamoring for what I call the perfect storm, which I'm sure you are all familiar with because it means it's the eclipse. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's not too humid yet. It's bluebonnet season, it's wildflower season, it's peak bird migration, the bats have started emerging. So when people are looking for a place to travel to go see the eclipse, guess where they're looking right now? Texas. So during any eclipse, regardless of the type, you have 4 points of contact. So first contact, that's just when the sun starts slipping over, or the moon starts slipping over the disk of the sun. The important parts are going to fall between second and third. So this is your beginning of totality or your beginning of annularity. And while this is going on, there's a lot of fun activity that's happening. So being aware of light and shadow, how the animals react. Animals, as you would expect, start feeling it getting a little darker, start feeling it getting a little cooler. Wow, I have lost track of time. I need to start going to feed, or I need to start hunkering down for the night. Human happens. You'll notice that folks will start getting kind of excited, like it's getting towards nighttime, getting towards doing something fun, active, being, you know, nothing, maybe nobody our age, but you know, the teenagers will start acting out. But you'll start seeing, you know, a lot of birds trying to make their way home. And you'll start seeing a lot of confused pollinators who are, oh, I didn't realize it was my shift yet. Okay, gotta get going. But it's a very temporary thing. So as we come out of totality, you're gonna have that kind of shock of like, oh, false alarm. Guess I need to go back to what I was doing. So that's when we have a lot of concern of animals on roadways interfering. So being very conscientious that if you're one of those people that the moment the eclipse is off, you're going to dart across back to your car and head home, be aware. There's probably some confused animals out there that are going to be coming back and going, sorry, made a mistake. So temperature and weather, hopefully clear skies, no clouds. But you will see the temperature, or you will feel the temperature decrease upwards of as much as 15 degrees during the whole process of the eclipse. Shadow bands will start to form. Now, these are very short-lived. Scientists aren't even really quite sure what shadow bands are, exactly how they occur. It has something to do with the light as it's getting filtered through our unstable atmosphere. But if you have an opportunity to, most commonly I've seen people laying out like a piece of white paper or a piece of like a white fabric or bed sheet even, right before the totality occurs, you might catch a little bit of rippling shadows across that. Usually it's a lot of students that are kind of doing that. So, you know, if you do wind up being in public, you know, odds are you'll probably be close to a set of kids that are doing different experiments. Things like, oops, now you work. Things like Davies beads. That's right before totality, where you're actually seeing light as it is filtering through areas of the lunar terrain, breaks in the area. So whether it's a break between two sets of you know, rock features or through two lips of craters, you'll start seeing these little dots. The diamond ring is sort of that last culminating bit of light before we enter totality. And that's when you start seeing more of the corona. That's when you get a lot of folks breaking out their telescopes, pulling off their filters, and looking at that coronal display around the sun while it's in totality phase. There's actually certain scientific experiments that we can only conduct during a total solar eclipse because we can't recreate that environment artificially. So I know Fredericksburg is definitely one of the areas where you're going to see a lot of scientists rolling in about a week prior and setting up a lot of experimentation. Planets and stars. If you're taking the time to look at that, you will see some planets and stars in the night sky. 360-degree sunset. It's a wild thing. If you're used to just seeing the sunset in the west, this occurs completely around you. So it's not going to get pitch black, but it's going to get sizably dark. And then we're going to go through the whole process in reverse for you 4 minutes and 25 seconds later. What's interesting is how plants react to this. What's, I guess, surprising, not so surprising, there hasn't been a lot of research that's been done in this area. You know, we know what animals do, we know what humans do. Nobody was really focusing on the plants. In fact, the first sort of recordings of research done with eclipses, there was an eclipse back in Europe in 1999, where they did some research into the effects that eclipses have on plants. And much like the research that they did in Wyoming in 2017, plants will stop photosynthesizing. The rates will decrease. The rates of transpiration will decrease, so they won't be releasing as much water. They go into almost a dormant phase. And it's very subtle in the sense that it happens slowly as it gets darker. What they found in 1999 in Europe is that the resurgence of the sun after the eclipse is a shock. And it usually is a good 24 hours, if not slightly more, for the plant to sort of establish its circadian rhythm again. So fortunately, eclipses are not long-term detrimental to plant life, but they have recorded the differentiation and how they react. Now, I do know that in light of this, a lot of researchers are making plans to do much more extensive studies next year with this eclipse. And I imagine that we'll start seeing a lot more research being done during eclipses and how plants react. Obviously, you know, as I mentioned earlier, just how confusing it is to, you know, the daytime pollinators thinking, oh, I gotta go tuck in for the night, and the nighttime pollinators, oh, the shift starts now. I guess I lost track of time. So you're gonna see a lot of, you know, a lot of bee activity. You might even see a few bats kind of popping up going, is it time yet? Really? This doesn't feel quite right. So it is a bit tumultuous, you know, but thankfully it is a rather short-lived experience. Nowhere in the world do we ever experience totality for more than, I think it's 7 minutes and 30 seconds. This one, like I said, about 4 minutes, a little less than 4 minutes and a half. So, you know, that kind of reaction that it has on plants is very circumstantial based on the type of plant. Another thing they noticed, for instance, I think it was in, what plant was it? Oh, they were looking at how it reacted in things like sagebrush. So sagebrush is what they were researching in Wyoming in 2017. But for things like other, you know, cactus plants, they noticed that the plants reacted not necessarily to the light, but to the change in temperature. So sometimes it's not just the light that's affecting them. They can be reactive by, you know, and triggered by the light change from, you know, totality or from annularity. Sometimes it's the change in temperature, which, like I said, can be as much as 15 degrees. Sometimes it's both. We still don't really quite know. And so that's an interesting area where, like I said, I think we're going to see a lot more scientific research coming out in the next year or so as we go through the one in 2024. And I think in general, as people become more aware of eclipses, you know, now that it's proliferated social media, at least in this state or in this country for the last 7 years in anticipation for 2024, I think it's an arena where we'll see a lot more scientific research and study. But back to night skies. So as I mentioned, plants are affected by light pollution in the sense that it disrupts their circadian rhythm. And that is no truer than it is in humans. So light pollution affects our circadian rhythm. It interrupts our ability to produce the right amount of melatonin. This is really especially common with folks that are shift workers, that work late nights, that have staggered schedules. They're most affected as opposed to those of us that just work standard days. Unfortunately, the effects of light pollution have some correlation to how we deal with every single type of cancer humans have the ability to contract. So light pollution plays into that, mainly in how it does degrade our melatonin production and how it affects our circadian rhythm. It makes it harder for our immune system to fight those sorts of diseases because it is compromised by these outside influences. Remember earlier when I said everybody thinks more light means more safe? That is not the case. And actually, even more so, it's more glare means less safe. This is probably the one on the right side is one of the most staggering displays of just how true that is. So in the case of the light above, this is one of your standard, double-headed Cobra floodlights that almost everybody at any point in time has probably had on the side of their garage or their house. And there's so much glare here, you can make out a little bit of the fence line, you can kind of tell that there's a break in the fence here, but it's until the photographer covers up that light just with their hands that you see that person hidden in the shadows. Same thing here. You can actually, by just covering up the light with your hands, and it would be exceptionally more clear to see that person if the actual light itself were shielded. But you can see that person, whereas you can't see them here. You can't even see the tree here until the temperature is changed. And that's more from, people get concerned about, okay, well, I want to be safe. I want to light up my whole house. I want to light up my land so that, I can see if anybody's trespassing. Well, you're not going to see that. And what's worse, if you think about it, if you're out, let's say just traveling about a town, and they don't have an outdoor lighting ordinance, and they're not really taking into consideration proper night sky preservation and lighting. You're out late in the evening and there's so much excess light, you can't see if there's even somebody friendly, let alone someone unfriendly coming towards you. You know what you also can't see? You. So you're in that glare of light as well. So it's not just from the standpoint of wanting to make sure that you can see any potential dangers. But if somebody, let's say, approaches you and puts you in a compromising situation, you're both now in the glare of light. And that means that any passerby, anybody driving by, any officer that happens to be in the vicinity can't see you either. And it's only when we take into consideration a few very simple fixes that we actually can see a lot safer environments. And this is one of those things where it's like somebody at one point in time put out a simple little, paper that says, oh, more light means more safe. We need to turn on all these lights. We need to add more lights. And that's unfortunately just become this proliferated myth that is one of the challenges that we face in doing night sky preservation work, and the hardest one to break folks up. Here's some other examples of, just environments where going in and making a few changes with regards to the temperature of a light or shielding it makes a huge difference. I mean, and I don't think we could see any clearer effect than when, a large gas station puts all their lights into recess, takes down that light color temperature, and suddenly it's a lot more friendly to go into this business than maybe this really bright glaring one. Because again, if you're going into a gas station for the sake of safety and security, that's going to be a much more friendly environment when you can see things and things can, you can be seen. Kind of speed through a few of these because I just got some indicator. So it's costing our country $3 billion, roughly, every year. We estimate that 1/3 of all outdoor artificial light shines up into the night sky, illuminating nothing whatsoever. No signage, no advertisements. And it's roughly costing our state $250 million. That I don't know about you, but I would like that for purposes of our state. We utilize a Bortle scale to determine the sky quality. So this is probably an image you're familiar with and a subset of one that we looked at earlier. And this just kind of gives you an idea of just where that bright boundary is. So, Fredericksburg, part of the city center, still has some improvements, but overall around still kind of falls on that edge of night perimeter. Simple principles. So things that you can start looking at home. Is the lighting that I use in my home shielded? In other words, can you see the bulb? If you can see the bulb, it's not night sky friendly. If it's fully shielded, if the bulb is recessed, if it's the right color temperature. If you're not going to keep it on all the time, set it on a timer, set it on a motion sensor sensor, or just turn it off entirely and only shining it where it needs to go. All you're doing shining a bright bulb up in the night sky is adding to the light pollution, and it's not even helping what you're trying to identify down below. This is in a lot of our information and a really great way of just sort of taking a look at, hey, I have a lot of, this kind of light here, and quick fix, I can go with something like this. So these are probably very familiar lights. I mentioned that sort of two-headed Cobra floodlight that caused all that glare issue, and ways that you can switch over to much more acceptable fixtures. I'm going to kind of jump through these. This gives you an idea of, again, that sort of breakdown of the edge of night and all this space here that we're trying to preserve, and all this space here that we are trying to work towards eliminating and getting more into that dark, excellent region. Up until the beginning of this year, we were under the impression by research and reporting that we were losing the night sky at a rate of 2% every year, which is staggering. Unfortunately, now those figures are up to 10%, which is just 1% below the rate at which we're losing the Amazon rainforest. Fortunately, we've got things like International Dark Sky Places, of which we just received notice that the city of Bee Cave a few months back received their designation. So we have a total of 13 across the hill country, and we have almost a dozen now that are either in the process of their application or are working towards preparing for their application. So doubling this is very feasible in the next 3 to 5 years. And I'd say even getting in advance of a state like Utah, which has more than we do, very, very viable.
What has the city of Fredericksburg done to improve their light? Because we live 1 mile from the airport to the southwest, and that whole sky is just bright all the time.
So the city does have an outdoor lighting ordinance, a very robust one actually, one that we use as a model for other communities. They were designated, I believe, back in 2015, I think. So they are designated as an international dark sky community. And last year, Gillespie County adopted a Night Sky Friends group. So they do have individuals that convene, as I mentioned, on a monthly basis to try to combat those kinds of issues. Now, unfortunately, the outdoor lighting ordinances are only enforceable within the city limits. So outside of that, in the extraterritorial jurisdiction, that is where it's really up to the good nature of the landowners, because if you weren't familiar, we like to do things differently here in Texas, and we are the only state in the union that does not give our counties the governing authority to control things like ordinances. But that's why having and convening presentations and meetings like this and talking with your neighbor and talking with folks and educating folks on light pollution is so important, because right now at this sort of early stage of this movement, it's the only way that we're going to get the message out to people. Let's get through some of these. So this is a night sky month. The entire month of October, we dedicate towards bolstering information, outreach, activities, everything from proclamations within counties and cities to things like the Hill Country Howl that takes place on the full moon that month. The communities in Hayes County and spreading outward over the past 3 years have enacted like outdoor candlelit dinners, under the moon dances, pretty much anything we can do to try to encourage folks to take into consideration night sky preservation and get out under the night sky. Because unfortunately, as this movement has come about, we've really begun to identify the fact that we've created a culture of people that have become inherently fearful of the dark. And so many wonderful things happen under the night sky that, it's, get this, it's more short on time. Even just going out and appreciating the night sky, whether it's, nighttime gardens or appreciating the stars or the bats, or just, taking advantage of living in a place where we can actually be out late in the evening and not be freezing cold, or it's pretty hot these days in the evenings. Still, there's so many things that can be done during the nighttime that as a society, we've really cut ourselves off from. I work in this capacity, and I'm also an amateur astronomer, and so I do a lot of star party events. And it's remarkable the number of folks that A, have never looked through a telescope, B, have never been out under dark skies, and C, don't even really consider coming out in the evenings because of that fear for the dark. So that's something we're, again, with sort of the safety and security issue, you know, the two big issues that we're trying to combat. Thankfully, we've got over 15 night sky groups across 11 counties that are helping us do this. So it's not just me, thankfully, but a lot of folks that are working towards this end goal of eliminating light pollution, and particularly folks in Gillespie County. That's it. Totally stay around to answer any questions you have, so don't feel like you have to start off. Yes.
So I tried to purchase dark sky lighting lately. It's very confusing. And you put dark sky lighting, not the rating system.
Nope. It's night sky friendly is, so he was asking, you know, the challenges that we face with going out and trying to purchase this lighting. Night sky friendly is not a quantifiable term. Many folks have an interpretation of that. Now, the International Dark Sky Association does have a fixture seal of approval program. And in the past 5 years, the work that's been done in that is extensive. It's hundreds of fixtures, both on a residential level, commercial level, and then industrial level. So that is one resource you have. So anytime you see the IDA logo on a fixture in things like Home Depot or Lowe's or Ace or such, you know that that meets those 5 criteria. But unfortunately, anybody can say, night sky friendly fixture, and you go, but wait, I can see the bulb, or wait, it's not fully shielded. So unfortunately, there is an aspect of education you need to do until we can have some form of mainstream definition that is clearly defined across the board.
But you can't go to internet dark skies.
You can, yes. Yes, in fact, on their homepage, if you just go to fixture seal of approval, you can search by a variable of criteria, but you can also type in a manufacturer as well.
Got those little low wattage, small bulbs on strings that see people hang on patios.
Yes, Paul was asking about the, you know, they're called festoon lights or even Christmas lighting. So in most communities that have strong outdoor lighting ordinances, they usually have a time frame during the year. So it's typically, you know, anywhere from like right after Thanksgiving through the new year where it's acceptable to hang up things like Christmas lights. In the case of a lot of low wattage lights, they don't necessarily put out excess amount of light to cause light pollution. Although in a lot of environments where you have, you know, let's say outdoor restaurant and they have them strewn everywhere, you know, there are ways that you can actually purchase little shields for those light fixtures. But also the idea is that, you know, most of those businesses, you know, they're not open 24 hours. So ideally what we want to say is, okay, if you have to have a light on there, if you're a business and you have to have these, you know, string lights on, you know, at the end of business, turn them off. Ideally, between the hours of about 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. are really the tenuous times where you don't want any excess lighting, especially during peak bird migration.